first of all, again, just thank you to all of you, to all the organizers, and of course to the Coast Salish peoples on whose land we do our work on. And I think, especially when we think about history and rupture, it's very important to recognize the Indigenous peoples of this land, and to give thanks as members of migrant suffrage communities. So when I was invited to speak, I was asked to talk about art and culture, and I was like, okay, that's a pretty broad topic, so let's see what we can do to kind of focus that on, because we can talk about, at length a number of things about food, dances, and accents, and church, and political corruption, and people power, and jeepneys, and so on. But this isn't going to be any kind of attempt to really define what Filipino culture is. And I want to thank Ken and Kara for also kind of providing a context of how we want to see and perceive the culture that we hope to create, knowing kind of what the situation of the Filipino community is. And I think we've already kind of seen a lot of examples already in terms of like the Nanay play and the fashion shows that we talked about. So I'll be talking about some other projects that we've been involved in. And of course, because it's a youth panel, which I was also like, uh-oh, because I'm not really that young anymore. But in terms of how the youth have been integral and involved in some of these projects. So let's talk a little bit about the context of the work of PWC and YWCA, the Filipino Canadian Youth Alliance, and some of what that is. So first, let's kind of return to this idea of culture. This is the cultural center of the Philippines, and it was in 1966. This was actually established under the Executive Order number 30 by, at that time, President Ferdinand Marcos. It was completed in 1969, and it was a huge pet project of Imelda Marcos as well, who really wanted to showcase Filipino art and performance. And over the years, it's often been criticized as an elitist institution, really inaccessible by the basic masses. So we have this contradiction, right? This kind of classic contradiction of art and culture as represented as kind of the standard of aesthetic excellence, of high quality and refinement, versus the culture in the sense of an everyday lived experiences, behaviors, expressions of our values and our beliefs, and in a way, kind of an identity that we try to build. And of course, even to try to define what that means in the Philippines, right? It's like there's 7,000 different islands, there's so many different cultural backgrounds, so we can't blanket and say that the Philippines has one cultural identity. And I know that people in Canada as well also have this kind of same situation where we're trying to define ourselves as Canadians in comparison to, we say we're American, right? So what does that mean even for Filipinos living in Canada? So we have already this kind of mix of different cultures, and we're coming in and dropped into a land that's also confused about its own identity. Keep this in mind. It's going to come together, trust me. So, well, hopefully. I just wanted to mention this as well, that the influential Filipino writer and historian Renato Constantino visits the concept of the Filipino, and that we have no real collective sense of a national identity, because it was never given a chance to flourish because of centuries of Spanish colonization, followed by Japanese occupation, American indoctrination, and colonization. In 1974, Constantino came to Canada to present one of the main papers of the World Sociology Congress in Toronto. In his paper, Identity and Consciousness, the Filipino Experience, he mentions that the Filipino media, the radio, comics, movies, and the national languages should be vehicles for the propagation of a Filipino identity. But they didn't, however, serve the purpose because they only served to widen an audience for an American culture. So Filipino movies were often rehashes of American movies. Radios made American songs more widely available, as well as jingles that advertised foreign goods, and TV that followed an American pattern. So basketball players and film stars became kind of these national idols of an Americanized society. So already you can kind of think that there's this indoctrination of going abroad as the means of achieving economic stability, of having the dreams across the ocean. So fast forward to the present day. We have this kind of identity, right? This idea in the community that's known as the 3 Bs of the Filipino community. I don't know if anybody knows what those are. And just shout it out if you know.
Basketball.
Youth contest.
Yeah.
And boxing.
And boxing, yes. Basketball, beauty pageants, and boxing. So, and kind of this idea that these are unifying factors because in the Philippines they play basketball, here basketball is popular, and it's something that kind of is a unifying thing for the community. But, let's say a lot of people don't subscribe to any of these, right? Oh, we're back at the Cultural Center. I wanted to come back to this. So, the reason why I wanted to bring this up was in 2011, the Cultural Center of the Philippines had to shut its doors to the main exhibit hall after controversy surrounding the work of artist Mateo Cruz, and some people might be familiar. He was exhibiting a work called Poeteismo as part of a group show, and is accused by many conservative groups of making a mockery of religion, according to GMA News. And I just want to illustrate some of the things that he had here. So this is just in a news report from GMA News, that he had a similar religious image of Christ, where his eyes are darkened by black ink, which appears to flow from his eyes. A religious image of Jesus Christ attached to the religious image is a wooden replica of the male genital protruding towards his face. The male genital replica is draped with a rosary hanging by the base and top of the replica. To a crucifix is attached a red male organ. So Mateo Cruz, he received a lot of death threats because from religious groups, and people wanted to sue him, and he kind of countered that he was a struggling artist, and what can they possibly take from him? And so even to know the hypocrisy in all of these criticisms in terms of the sexual nature of the artwork, and yet in this kind of conservative Catholic society that in the Philippines, there's this hypersexualized image of the Filipino woman, the docile woman, and so on. So he was making a big comment on a lot of these contradictions. So he's a controversial figure in the Filipino art world, and I think I'm kind of name dropping, really, because in 2007, Mateo was here, and some people here in this room worked with him. Him and his partner Raquel came to Vancouver and took part in the live Peñali of performance art. And we had the opportunity as members of the Kalayaan Center and Sinagbayan to collaborate with them on a performance that was part of our Muleta exhibit here in 2007. This is part of that collaboration. At the time, we were involved in a campaign to stop political killings in the Philippines, and so we had someone dressed all in white, and we projected faces of some of the victims of political killings on their faces. So it's really kind of this ghostly image, and this is like a live person standing up as well. So, and this was actually the closing night of our Muleta exhibit, and we did some live painting in which you put on some of the headlines that were coming from newspapers. Just going to fast forward through some of this here. Oh, I skipped it. That's okay. You'll kind of see an idea of some of the different exhibits from the Muleta project that we did here. So some main points about our Muleta project. It was a metaphor for what we pack, what we leave behind, the burdens that we carry. And it made its debut at Gallery Gachet. It had more than 200 people, and this was according to the Gachet organizers, that there was more than 200 people in attendance at that opening night. We were lucky because we were in the middle of another festival that we were a part of as well, called Heart of the City. So there was a lot of promotion that was done outside of our own efforts to promote some of the work that we were doing. Overall, there were more than 40 participants who helped create pieces here. These are artists, community members, organizers who collaborated on a lot of these amazing art installations, and children of domestic workers, paintings, sculptures, and performance pieces. And the project really brought together Filipino Canadian artists and the community in these kind of multidisciplinary art practices, and a lot of people who never considered themselves to be art practitioners. And people who were even just curious about art, and people who considered themselves either artists or designers but had no idea about the issues that were happening in the community. So when you bring all this together, this is kind of the stuff that you get out of it, is this artwork, and the artwork is really the product of a dialogue that happened between all of these different experiences coming together. in the lead up to the Muleta Project, we actually ran a 10-week course where we, continually met every week, and we did our own like art criticisms, and people talked about the projects that they wanted to do, and we developed them over 10 weeks leading up. And it was a big, it was kind of a risky thing for Gachet as well, because when you submit something to an art gallery, they kind of want to see process work, or they want to see completed work, evidence that you have something there. And we're like, well, we're going to create the work through this process. And so it took a while. Actually, we submitted something to them. It was a 2-year process. So we submitted something, and then when they went through the rounds of selecting shows, they had open time in 2007 to be able to host us. So a lot of the work was done by members of the Filipino Canadian Youth Alliance, but it was also very much informed by the work of SICLAB and by the research projects of the Philippine Women's Center. So somebody would say, well, I have this idea for this art project, and they would kind of throw it out in one of our meetings, and other people would say, that's an amazing idea, can I help you with it? And somebody would say, I have this idea, but I don't have enough information, what can I do? And so some of the participants in the Muleta Project, in the fashion show, who either don't have direct experience or don't have family, who came under the LCP, but through their art production, through this process of meeting and integrating, they learned about the issues of the living caregivers, and they felt the need to properly and honestly portray their stories. And many even went on afterward to create their own songs afterward and their own art pieces based off of things that they learned, outside of kind of the work of the formal project itself. So what was great about this was that the Muleta Project also traveled. This is, I'll talk about that in a moment. This was the closing night, so you get a different context here. So we were able to work with Raquel and Mateo, who are performance artists. And for people who were part of this 10-week project, we had people who were interested in actually being part of the performance. So some of you probably remember some of that, I think you were there. So on one side of the gallery, we had kind of the Philippine situation, the political killings that were happening, in terms of journalists and labor organizers being killed. And then on this side of the gallery, we had kind of the migration story. So while we were painting all these kind of Stop the Killing slogans, Mateo came out with a suitcase, and he just left it there, and he locked it down. And after a few minutes, he unzipped it, and people didn't realize that there's actually somebody inside. So we had somebody who was small enough to fit in there. I mean, it was a pretty sizable leather bed. So she stood up, and then we had her dressed in all white, and on her body were projected images of domestic workers who had faced abuse and who were in the media. So it's kind of media stories of domestic workers. And so the outcomes, some of the legacy that this kind of the places of the Muleta family, which actually did travel to Toronto and to Montreal, where they had their own Muleta exhibits and their own Muleta projects. So it wasn't a recreation; it was really, they took their own experiences and their own stories and carried it forward. And even, of course, you heard from others that they're doing their current exhibit even right now. So it's still alive. And so the family is actually making their home in the East. They've also migrated. It's our own family separation. The context of this is actually kind of, the story of a Filipino family who was separated. So we have the mother, who's a domestic worker, who's taking care of a baby with blonde hair. And what's not on here is her graduation cap. And in her hand is like pennies. And then the father who's a janitor, the young boy who's being bullied at school, and on his back it says "kick me." The young girl who's dyed her hair blonde and has blue eyes because she's facing an identity crisis, and the little baby who's reaching out for the mother who's not there. And how we displayed it in the gallery was, we had the family physically together and then the mother separated apart. So the spatial kind of relationship was very important. But yeah, so back to kind of the 3Ds. And so I was saying earlier that, we probably, many of us don't necessarily subscribe to this as the image of the Filipino community. And even though Muleta was in 2007, the cultural work of the youth organization of the Filipino Youth Alliance has always been an integral part in the work that they've been doing, that we've been doing since 1995. So instead of the 3 Bs, we have what we call the 3 Rs, which is roots, rhymes, and resistance. So the background to roots, rhymes, and resistance is that in 1998, the Filipino Canadian Youth Alliance launched a campaign called the Philippine American War Campaign. And it was an educational campaign to recognize 100 years of the Philippine American War, kind of that anniversary, or what was kind of recognized as the official Philippine American War from 1898 to 1902, although some people would say that the war kind of continued until the beginnings of the First World War. And even the aftermath of that, there was still a lot that was happening, and even until today as a colony. So the campaign, of course, was not just about having performances and artwork, but included workshops on Philippine history, lecture series on the effects of war and the current state of the Philippines. So we would ask guest speakers to come in and speak. There was a signature campaign calling for an apology from the U.S. government to the Filipino people. And it was in all of this context that Roots, Rhymes, and Resistance was born, because we wanted to be able to have a cultural method now that we've been doing all these lectures and educational events, that, well, we wanted to do something with all that knowledge that we were gaining, so we wanted to present it back. So our work was always evolving. In the past, we'd always had this idea that we were always looking at issues happening in the Philippines, so about our Philippine history, but also about the current state in the Philippines, but then also about the current state of our community. And a lot of that has now kind of evolved. So even Roots, Rhymes, and Resistance has evolved to where it wasn't by the time we had our last show in 2010, it wasn't necessarily about the Philippine American War, it wasn't necessarily Philippine history, but it was about our community's issues, and it was about what was happening, and it was about being relevant about what was going on in our community. Okay. Okay, we're good? Okay. So in 1999, the first Roots, Rhymes, and Resistance was held at the Grind and Gallery Cafe on Main Street. It would be there until 2001. One of the other motivations that we had for this was that we were looking at the Asian Heritage Month program at that time, and there was really no Filipino programming. There was no Filipino programming. So we wanted to include that. So we intentionally, the first one was in '99, and it was in May. And then we wanted to have, no, it was in September. And then we wanted to have one right away in May of the next year, because May was Asian Heritage Month. And then, so that's where, when we say it's like the first annual or second annual, we kind of lose track because it wasn't always in the same month. So eventually we just started calling Roots, Rhymes, 2006, 2007. So through the Vancouver Asian Heritage Month Society, we were able to access larger venues, and we eventually moved out of the Grind, and we had performance space at the Western Front Artist Run Center, and we continue having working relationship with the Western Front for the next few years. So this is at the Western Front. This is 2005. Each year we had a different theme. So the first year we had Roots, Rhymes, and Resistance. 2005 we had what was called Living the Storm. We also wanted to recognize that 2005 was the 35th anniversary of the first quarter storms in the Philippines, which is big student uprisings in the first year of 1970. So again, more in our Philippine history, but then also how were we also continuing that legacy and building our own culture. So here are some kids that we always involve, of course. They're so big now. So these, I don't know if some of you might know Saul. Diana, that's him.
Saul?
Oh, the tallest guy there.
Yeah.
So he's now, an amazing performer, spoken word artist, rapper, and organizer in his own right. He's in his first year at UBC. Kaitami performed over a number of years. I don't know if some of you may know her as well. So it's great to see kind of a lot of, and Kim even earlier mentioned that her introduction to a lot of the work was through Roots, Rhymes, and Resistance. So it's really kind of amazing to be witness to a lot of these performers and these artists who are doing amazing things. You know, you kind of have like, oh, I knew them before they were famous because they performed at the Western Front at Roots, Rhymes, and Resistance. So some of our posters, Our Beautiful Struggle was our theme for 2007. Root Down, Rise Up was our theme for 2009. Actually, it took a while, but we had to try to trace back all the different themes that we had, and I'm going to read them for you now. So, 1999, Root, Challenge, and Resistance. The next year was called Reclaiming Our Past, Shaping Our Future. In 2001, we had Our Heroes, Our Heritage, Our Struggle, which we also at that year released a compilation of poetry and artwork in a small chapbook. 2002 was called Every Word is a Weapon for Freedom, a line taken from a Carlo's poem. 2003 was called Ang Dapat Gawin, which is It Must Be Done. 2004, one of my favorites was Of Rice and Revolution. And so we talked about it in terms of how the Filipino people are producers of rice, but we also produce revolution. We wanted to encourage that. 2005, Ipang Patuloy, Living in the Storm. 2006, Rice Against the Machine. 2007, Our Beautiful Struggle. 2008, Balik sa Comunidad, Balik sa Ugat, so back to the community, back to our roots. 2009, Root Down, Rise Up. And 2010, which was the last one that we had the capacity to kind of continue, was Panahon Natin, Our Moment, Step Up, Stand Out.
Carlo, if I may just continue. We continued our effort in Toronto. So in 2011, we had laying tracks against cutbacks to like really look at the situation here in Canada and how cutbacks are being just implemented. And then the last one was taking back our future, the same thing, because the future, the youth future is at risk. So we really, in terms of our new path, with that rupture, we already started implementing a program based on our struggle for just and genuine settlement and integration. So, yes.
Yes, so thank you. I was actually going to mention that, you know, we had our last one here in 2010, Muleta Heroes 2007. The last fashion show was 2008. So, you know, I think it's maybe time, it's putting it out there, maybe there's something that we can continue, right? So this is from 2009, dance workshop with album from Latino. What we wanted to do, you know, as we kind of did all these years of Roots Rhymes, we were asking a lot of people, well, here's our theme, can you perform something under it? And didn't always, you know, it was pretty broad. So in the later years, we kind of went back and said, okay, well, let's take our lessons from what we learned from Muleta, and let's do all of these workshops leading up to Roots Rhymes, and at least make, you know, 50–60% of all the performances come out of these workshops. So we had dance workshops. That was at the Canadian Center. We had writing workshops with Hiromi Goto, who's a Japanese Canadian writer. So people who wrote poetry and wrote narratives performed some of their work. Mural painting project. There's Kim at the bottom. And behind her is Riva Diana, who did the poster, the second poster for the fashion show. And kind of these big mural painting projects, which we hung up as the backdrops on these rides for that year. So I want to end with this, just a few things. So really looking at how kind of these cultural forms and this cultural production has been so integrated. It's never been something that was an afterthought to our work. It was always something that was produced as part of the work. That youth, here we're not just consumers of culture, we're producers of culture. And that we always kind of encourage kind of these different ways of seeing the world, you know, whether it's something that we see in architecture, colors and shapes, and learn from it, and see all of these things that are around us as these forms of ideological struggle, you know, and how can we also disturb that and create that. Because you walk out of this room and you're downtown and you're in SkyTrain, you're going to get bombarded with a lot of different cultural messages, so we need to also be able to create our own culture. And in this whole process, so one of the big lessons that we learned from all of this is that the end product isn't always kind of the shining thing that comes out of it. It's really in the process of our making and the process of coming together to talk about what we're creating that we're actually making cultural activists that everybody who becomes involved. And there were also kind of, it's not so much necessarily about a Filipino culture or a Canadian culture, but it's creating a culture in Canada, on stolen land, for Filipinos in this multicultural society, whatever that might be. And I think we might not have the answer for it, but through all this work, we're working at something. So we also wanted to use these to disrupt these kind of conventional ideas of immigration and settlement. I want to talk about this because this is behind Tupper High School. This boulder here is the memorial to Mao Jomar Landa, who was a youth who was beaten to death in 2003. We were able to actually have Roots, Rhymes, and Resistance after we moved out of the Western Front at the Tupper Auditorium, which is great because that was something that the school had recognized, that we were doing a lot of work in the community on racism education, on the situation of Filipino youth, and that we had been very integral in the anti-racism work that was happening around the death of Mao Jomar Landa. So they were open to us to being there. And I thought it was appropriate to kind of end on a quote that's on this boulder, which is attributed to Mao Jomar Landa, that culture is the root of our lives, and love is the most powerful force. So if you haven't seen that, go to it. And this is actually something that is an ongoing project that I want to do in terms of some of these cultural spaces that we see. And if you just look at kind of the visuality of this, and this is kind of a nice new metaphor for the community, where we're not anymore like this migratory, transient kind of thing, but we're looking for permanent residency. We're looking for a permanent place to settle, and we're already second, going on third generation Filipinos. Eventually, in our fourth and fifth generation, what is that going to look like, and what are our youth in the future going to be facing, and what kind of identity are they going to take on? So when I look at this, I see stone, I see something heavy, unmovable, something that's rooted in the ground, something that's embedded in this land, something so, and because we're here and we're embedded, we want to be able to participate fully and settle and have something that we can grow and have our own roots, I guess, in a sense. So kind of a nice image. So that's it. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you.